In 1270, Prince Edward of England came to his father, King Henry III, and stated his intention to go on crusade. A parliament was held to discuss the matter. Crusades were extremely expensive, and Edward would need serious financial support, and so a tax would have to be raised. Earlier in his father's reign, similar situations had caused major problems. Henry III had made promises to go on crusade, racked up huge debts to do so, and then failed to keep his vows. So any suspicion of Edward's intentions would have been understandable. But the prince was a very different character to his father, and by far more a man of his word. When everything was agreed upon, Edward began to make physical and spiritual preparations for the crusade, asking the monks of Winchester to pray for him. Edward then set sail from Dover in August 1270, accompanied by his wife, Eleanor of Castile, and brother, Edmund Crouchback. Edward's initial plan was to join Louis IX of France on crusade, but the Eighth Crusade that Louis had led had been brought to an end by the death of the French king, just a few days after Edward had left England. On arriving in Tunis, Edward found he was too late. Louis's son, now King Philip III, had signed a treaty which had brought the crusade to a close. Edward now had a choice to make. Should he abandon the venture and return home? But Edward was not a man for quitting, and so he travelled to the Holy Land, landing in Acre on the 9th of May 1271. Edward's journey was not a smooth one. His small fleet had encountered a heavy storm, and disaster very nearly befell the English prince, but he eventually reached dry land. Edmund joined him in September of that year. Nearby, the Mamluk Sultan Baibars was attacking Montfort Castle, which belonged to the Teutonic Knights. Before Edward and his band of men could do anything to relieve the siege, however, Baibars had starved the castle's Christian defenders into submission, and an agreement was reached on the 12th of June 1271 that the castle would be handed over to Baibars if the Christians were allowed to go free. A few days later, the castle was handed over. Naturally, this caused much frustration and anger among Edward's men. Having been away from home for some time already, they had yet to accomplish anything of note, and had nearly been killed in the process. They wanted retaliation against Baibars, but Edward was more level-headed. Baibars' forces vastly outnumbered the men available to Edward, and attacking them would practically be suicide. Instead, Edward, backed by Templar, Hospitaller, and Teutonic Knights, launched an attack on a town called Khakoun, where he inflicted heavy losses on the Muslims. However, the brutal summer heat meant that Edward's army also suffered considerable losses themselves, and eventually they retreated before Baibars could bear down on them. Later that year, in the winter of 1271, Edward and his men helped repel an attack on Acre by Baibars, but really that was as good as it got for the Crusade. The Crusading era in the Holy Land was in its dying embers. In the next 2 decades, Tripoli and Acre would fall, spelling the end of the Crusader states. Prince Edward had agreed a truce with Baibars, but would have known the sincerity of it when the Sultan sent an assassin to have Edward killed. The assassin had been disguised as a servant to Edward, and had won the trust of the prince, to the extent that he was allowed access into Edward's tent. One night, the assassin woke Edward from his sleep and lunged at him with a dagger laced with poison. He struck a deep blow into Edward's hip. In turn, Edward struck a heavy blow to the assassin's head, full on the temple. Given how powerful Edward was, this may have been enough, but the prince made sure his assassin was dead by striking him with a table knife. Although Edward survived, he would feel the effects of this for some time, and his return to England would be a long one. Contrary to popular belief, Edward's wife Eleanor did not suck the poison out of Edward's wound, and instead had spent the time Edward was being treated by his doctors, worrying herself sick. As Edward began his long journey home, he would have felt many different emotions. No doubt, disappointment being one of them. The Crusader states were clearly no longer salvageable. Divisions among the Christians in the east were rife, and, try as he might, Edward had been unable to build any bridges. Edward would have also been relieved to have survived the Crusade. Disease, drowning, and assassination could have all easily claimed his life during the expedition, and in November 1272, while staying at Sicily recovering from his wounds, Edward was informed his father, King Henry III, had died. His joy with becoming king was tinged with sadness, as the Crusade had denied him one last opportunity to see his father. Nonetheless, Edward had shown himself to be a fine leader, one who would make a quite exceptional king.